Hello, and thank you for joining me. I want to thank Life Coach University for giving me an opportunity to pay it forward using my experience and my expertise in education to share with you some very simple concepts, mainly taken from psychology, that can really help in your everyday lives. So please go ahead and think about what you can do to pay it forward. Day 6. So today we're talking about false dichotomy, or sometimes referred to as false dilemma. Now, this is a pretty simple concept, but it's very powerful. It's very useful. And we talked about lifelong learning. Well, this is a fun one to learn because you're going to start seeing it everywhere. You're going to see it everywhere. You're going to want to use it, and you can use it for good or you can use it for evil, right? And so this is a concept which we can first define, and we will, but it's also one that is best learned through examples. There are certain concepts when it comes to learning that the best way to learn it is to define, and that's sufficient. However, there are other types of material that you're learning, which is best learned through examples. And the more diverse and variety of examples, the more comprehensive and more solid you will be able to learn that concept. So let's go ahead and get started in terms of false dichotomy or false dilemma. Now, for our purposes, you can really dive deep into this. Again, I'm not a philosopher. This can be something that is definitely broken down much, much greater in detail. But for our purposes, we can use them synonymously. It's basically presenting two choices or limited options when in fact there are more options. So think of false dilemma as just presenting less than the true number of options that there exists. And then false dichotomy is presenting only two options. So one could present there's only three options when in fact there might be 4, 5, 6, 8 options, but you're presenting it certainly less than the number of true options. And then the word false dichotomy means that two, so they're only being presented as only having two options. So once again, examples is the best way to learn this. So let's go ahead and get started with example number 1. I work in education. I've worked with younger students, elementary school, middle school, high school, all the way up to college students. And this concept exists in every level. So for example, when we're talking about the courses that a student takes, the thought process is, if we're talking about two options, it is often presented this way. Is it better to take harder classes and get lower grades? Or is it better to take easier classes and get higher grades? So more difficult classes get low grades, or take easier classes and get high grades. This is a pretty common question or dilemma that a lot of high school students face, because when it comes to applying to colleges, at least here in the US, the difficulty and the rigor of the courses is taken into consideration. In fact, the level of rigor of courses actually gets factored into the GPA calculation, very much like Olympics, where the scoring of a performance, whether it's ice skating or diving, the level of difficulty enhances the probability for a higher score. So again, it is a false dichotomy because, once again, think about it. Why does it seem like if you take more rigorous classes, you have to get bad grades? Or you think and assume that if you take easier classes, that you're going to get better grades? Because what do we know? That there are other options. You can take rigorous classes and you can get high grades. That is true. Just as you can take easy classes and get poor grades. So there's two sort of components that really these false dilemmas, dichotomies really fall into, which is these components. Number one is that they're mutually exclusive. That might be a concept some of you are familiar with. Mutual exclusive just means if there are these two options, if you're in one option, you can't be in the other. right? They're mutually exclusive. You're either alive or you're dead. Okay, so you can't be both at the same time. And so this is one of the assumptions or attributes of the false dilemma. Also, the second component is that it's collectively exhaustive. It's a fancy way of just saying whatever options that are presented is made to think that those are all the options there are. There's no other options. So even if it's 3 or 5, it doesn't have to be 2, it could actually be more. But even then, it is presented as if those are all the possible choices. So as I had mentioned from the very beginning, one of the best ways to be comfortable and get familiar with this concept of false dichotomy, false dilemma, is to go through some examples. So let's go back to that academic example, either difficult classes, lower grades, easier classes, or better grades. So working with students who are also looking at applying to various programs, when a individual is applying into educational programs, applying early does have its advantages. Well, think about it. If you apply early, you're competing for the total number of open seats in that program or that school. As you wait, and as the seats are filling up or being allocated for students that have been admitted, you are competing for fewer spots, which means that there is a mathematical, statistical disadvantage of applying later and later. Because as you wait, fewer and fewer seats are available. So that is the concept. So what happens is a lot of students will come and ask, is it better for me to apply early, but not have like the greatest essays completed for my application? Or is it better to apply late, but with a much better written essay? So as I'm sure you're starting to get comfortable, this is a false dichotomy. A specific example of dichotomy where it's presenting as this or that. And again, we know from the prior example that there are other options, or there is a third option in this case, which is, why don't you apply early with the strong essay? So we continue on. I mean, there's so many examples, but again, I want to share with you all these different examples that it'll become so comfortable and easy for you to spot them. And importantly, what can you do to respond to these or to use it to your advantage? And I'll share those with you as well. So another example might be sometimes, even if you're not a gambler, there will be times when someone says, bet on black or red, odd or even. For those of you that are familiar, that is the game known as roulette. In casinos, they have this round device where a metal sphere is thrown in there and it jumps around, and randomly it falls into one of the numbers. And every number obviously is going to be an even or odd or black or red. Or is it? Some of you who are familiar with the roulette wheel, you would be correct to say that is a false dichotomy. It is not just black and red or odd or even, but there is actually a green colored slot on that wheel. And I believe, depending on what country the roulette is made, or maybe the style of roulette, some roulettes have 1 0 that's colored green, and in others there's actually another slot, 00, which is green. So that really changes the actual mathematics of it. So that is another example. Now, another false dilemma, again, just making that distinction, false dichotomy is 2 false dilemmas, or there's more options. There's more options being presented than there truly exists. So a false dilemma example might be, or one could argue, the US political party system. Now, some people would say it's a false dichotomy because it's either Republican or Democrat. It's either liberal or conservative. And again, by definition, that is a very dichotomous way of presenting the options. But anyone who's studied a little bit and paying attention in government class will know that no, there are actually independents, right? And again, this will vary depending on country to country, but at least here in America, it is seen as there's only a few options. And again, it's primarily two, Republican, Democrat. But for those of us, libertarian might be another option. So again, it's this concept that you have far fewer options than there really exists. So I want to move the context to something that is probably a little bit more closer to home and hopefully valuable to you, especially for you parents. So I remember learning this back as a college student, this concept of false dichotomy, false dilemma. And I found it so fascinating. And just as when we learn something new, whether it be language, because if it is language, don't we want to try it on someone who's a native speaker and then see if they understand what we're saying? Or just getting a new toy and we want to test it out. So for me, when I became a parent, for some bizarre reason, this concept of false dichotomy came to mind, and I wanted to use it to my advantage. And the way I did that was, I wanted my daughter to eat her vegetables. And most kids, well, your kids might be different, but my kid did not want to eat vegetables. So what I did was I presented a false dichotomy. I told her, hey, Kylie, would you like to eat the carrots or the broccoli? And when I presented it that way, as a young child, you do not recognize that there's another option. There's plenty of other options. But because of her youth and just not unfamiliar with this fallacy, she always chose one. I believe she chose broccoli. So it was a great way to have her eat her veggies. And of course, you can use that for all kinds of other purposes. You want to, so you could even use it for, hey, did you want to clean your bedroom, or did you want to clean the garage? I mean, there are just an endless number of ways you can use this, and just so have fun with that. Now, obviously, this goes the other way as well. Now Kylie is no longer a child who's being presented with the false dichotomous choice of two different vegetables, but she's actually using it back to me. So what I mean by that is she's at the age now where she'll be driving soon. In fact, she has earned her permit, and she is allowed to drive behind the wheels. And so for her, she presents the false dilemma of, would you like to buy me a new car and have a peace of mind knowing that I'm safe and I have a reliable car? Or would you rather get me a used car that's not reliable and I could be stranded somewhere and I could totally, be in harm's way? So you can see that even our children will eventually come to learn about this little nifty concept, and they could use it on us. But because you've watched this video and you remember that you can respond by letting them know that, hey, listen, those aren't the only options, okay? There's no such thing as just because it's a new car that it's completely reliable, and if it's a used car, that is not reliable. And same thing with safety, right? I mean, safety, there's various consumer reports and product evaluations which test for things like safety. And you could have a brand new product, in this case, a car, that doesn't rate very highly in terms of safety. But a older model car, let's say 3 to 5 years ago, that model, when it was tested, performed actually really well in safety. So again, that is yet another example, a tangible example of this concept of false dichotomy. And this exists in so many different areas of our lives. I live in Los Angeles, very close to Los Angeles, California. And when we talk about baseball, there is this sort of assumption that you're either a Los Angeles Dodgers fan or a Los Angeles Angels fan. One's a team in the National League, the other is a team in the American League. And so it is this false dichotomy of who's your team? Well, the answer could be neither. I don't like baseball. So again, I mean, there's so many of these examples. You can come up with your own. I know you can. But just knowing about it is not enough. What do you do to respond? What do you do when someone is trying to use a false dilemma to make their case against you? Well, this is where you are going to respond directly to the two concepts we talked about earlier. The concept of mutually exclusive, that just because one is in one category and the other appears to be completely separate, they can actually both coexist. So one specific example that comes to my mind is when we learned that this is going way back to our early childhood, when we're learning about different animals, the difference between mammals and birds. Do you all remember when we learned about the platypus? If you don't remember, it's okay. You can just do a quick Google search these days. The platypus is a mammal, but it lays eggs. And I remember coming across that the very first time as a kid, like, that's confusing. Only birds lay eggs, right? Or reptiles actually lay eggs as well, and amphibians lay eggs, but mammals don't lay eggs. And so this is where, again, knowing that if you can present an example or an argument that whatever is being presented to you as this false dichotomy, and you can come up with evidence that those two are not mutually exclusive, they can actually coexist. That another example that comes to my mind is, if you are against gun, then you're against law enforcement. I mean, just these really extreme false black and white, and in fact, that's actually what is sometimes called a black and white fallacy, that these two things are being presented. It's got to be this or it's got to be that. So the best way to respond to that is to present, no, there is this third option where both can be in the same sort of coexistence. Okay, so that's the mutually exclusive counter argument, or you could also counter this concept of collective exhaustive characteristics of what they presented, meaning that again, it's more than dichotomy, so it's more than two. So they can say, maybe give you three options, but it turns out that you could actually come up with more. So having three kids, who do you love most, right? Do you love big sister? Do you love a brother? Or do you love the youngest daughter? And again, that is a false dilemma. And the way you would argue that is, listen, it's possible to love all three of you. In fact, it's possible to love all of you, your mom, grandma, grandpa, and everybody else. So again, the best way to argue these or respond to these would be to present options that clearly convey additional options. I hope that makes sense. Again, I really didn't want to overcomplicate. It's pretty simple, but I thought it was a pretty cool one to share with you during this month-long, lifelong learning series for Pay It Forward. Thank you so much for joining me. I look forward to speaking with you tomorrow. Take care.